And we're not even going to talk about my hair because humidity. Hello everybody, June here. Thank you for coming back. This is the very long, very last minute overdue Mood Soy Network project for September. And for this project, I chose the Love Notions lyric dress because I saw it on Island Socialist, and I'll leave a link to her video below, and I really liked the way that it looked on her. Now, it doesn't look the way on me just because we chose different views and we have different body types, but I still like the dress. For the fabric, I will also leave a link in the description box. It is a stretch cotton sateen from Mood, of course, and it is on a cream background, and I don't know if you can see it here well, but it has flowers and then a little bit of like animal print. And I first saw it in a voile, but it's getting to be that season where voile is no longer appropriate because we are now in fall. So I decided to get the fabric in a bit of a heftier weight so that I could actually wear it in fall as well as what is no longer summer, because it is not summer. And of course, typical June tradition, I suppose, I've had this fabric since the beginning of the month, but it has been a bit of a labor of love to make. So this dress started out as a different version with another fabric, because as always I wanted to make sure that by the time that I got to my actual fabric I had ironed out all the kinks. And that dress was a bit of a disaster for more than one reason. First of all, the fabric was awful. Not this fabric, but the other fabric that I tried for my wearable muslin was awful. It was scratchy and it was stiff, even though it was supposed to be a poplin, but that fabric is another story entirely. For the first time that I tried the pattern, I chose to do a size 16 with a D bust, because Love Notions does have different bust sizes, which is great. And I'll get to that when I'm actually doing the full review of the pattern itself in a minute. But I chose a 16 with the D cup, and then I graded out to an 18 at the waist. And it was so big. It was big on the bust and it was enormous at the waist. So when I made it in this fabric, I decided to go with a 16C cup and a straight 16, so it's also a 16 at the waist. And I will say that even a 16 at the waist is still a little bit loose, especially because this is a stretch fabric. It could be a little bit tighter, but the way that I put it together didn't actually, I mean, like I based it and stuff, but it is what it is. And it could be tighter, but it's fine. Okay, so now that I've told you the size that I picked and the fabric, let me talk about the adjustments that I had to make to this pattern. So I don't recall off the top of my head what height this is drafted for, but when I made my muslin and then my wearable, which is not wearable, muslin, I realized that the bust point was just too low. And when I decided to go from the D cup to the C cup, I made another muslin in muslin, and even then it was really low. So for the bust darts here on the side, I used the same dart points on the side seam, and then I just angled the end of the dart a little bit up and in, so that my bust darts would come in a little bit closer to my bust point, because they were also very far out. And then for the waist darts here, again, they just weren't in a place that corresponded to my bust and my body, so I moved them in, I think about a half an inch, maybe 3/4 of an inch, and then I extended the bust about a 1/4 of an inch up from, not the bust, the dart end, about a 1/4 of an inch up, so it sits a little bit higher on my bust, closer to my apex but not at my apex, and just giving the whole bust area a better shape, because it was otherwise very baggy down here. And then I shortened the bodice half an inch above the dart. So between the arm side and the dart, I shortened half an inch. So in the end, my darts came up quite a bit because I'm short, and I'm not short-waisted, but for some reason this particular pattern, the bust darts were just really low for me. And in hindsight, if I was to make this again, I would shorten the bodice another 1/2 inch, but I would do it between the shoulder and the bust point. So I would shorten the arm side, which of course also means that you have to shorten the sleeve to go along with that. But I think shortening the bodice between the bottom of the arm's eye and the shoulder takes care of some of this excess fabric that I have here. And the excess fabric doesn't really bother me, but if I was to make this dress again, those are some of the changes that I would make to better fit my body. Because in the end, I had to take a slightly larger seam allowance on the waist than the pattern calls for, so that it would sit a little bit higher on my body and be a little bit more, so it would sit at a place where I liked the look of. Otherwise, the waisting was a little bit low, which was a problem with my very first one. It was really low and it just looked awful. And with all of that out of the way, it is time to talk about the pattern. And I'm a little bit conflicted about this pattern because even though I like the final product and I know that you always have to make changes to patterns, you can't expect something to fit right out of the box. There are things that are not the drafting that I have issues with this pattern. And to be frank, I had the same but I had the same complaints with the Love Notions, I forgot what it was called, but it was a peplum t-shirt in the pink and white stripes that I made a video of. I'll leave a link of that to that down below as well. The issue is that the pattern instructions are a jumbled mess. They don't follow a logical progression. You have to like jump around to find things, and I know that there's different views and I know there's different sleeve types, but just the way that it's organized is very disorganized. And I don't really need the instructions all that much, but for somebody who does, it can be a problem. One other thing with the instructions that ties into that whole issue with progression and steps is that the instructions call for the sleeves to be set in flat, or rather to be sewn flat, because if they're sewn in flat, they're not actually set in. You can do what you want, but a sleeve that is not in a knit really ought to be set in the round. And I did mine in the round because that is just what I've done. And I think part of the reason that I found the instructions to be a little jumpy is because they have you basically sew the skirt front to the bodice front, skirt back to the bodice back first, and then sew the entire side seam from the sleeve all the way down to the hem in one go. And I am fine with sewing that seam that way without the sleeve. So from the arm side all the way down to the hem, perfectly fine, no issues with that, although I didn't do it that way. But the sleeve has to be set in. I have never sewn in a sleeve flat in a woven fabric that I liked. And the thing is that there is not a lot of sleeve cap ease in this dress. So sewing it in the round, so setting a sleeve in, it's not that difficult. You're not gonna have trouble. You're not going to end up with puckers or anything. So I'm not sure why they have you do the sleeve flat and then the side seams all in one go. There is one instance in which I think having the side seams sewn all in one rather than bodice and then skirt to bodice is for adjusting the side seams. And if I had done my side seams that way, I would have been able to take it in a little bit more on the sides. And so that's the one advantage of having the side seam be one rather than split at the waist, is that you can take it in or let it out. But you can take this dress in, but you can't let it out. My other complaint about this pattern is that the seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch, which is not enough. For a knit, that's fine. For a woven, for home sewing, it is not enough. So when I sew with other patterns, they usually have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which I think is a little much. My preference when I sew patterns that I have to add seam allowances to is 1/2 inch. But 3/8 of an inch is really small, especially if you want to do things like, I mean, gathering. For gathering, you need a little bit more. There's no gathering in this skirt because I chose the A-line, but there's an option to do a gather skirt. And then there's the fact that you can't let it out. You can't use the seams to adjust for width. Now, you can do that at the darts, but once you've pressed the darts, I mean, the side seams are just easier. And I think that having 1/2 inch or 5/8 of an inch as a standard would be better. And that's another thing. If you're used to having 5/8 of an inch and you don't fully read the instructions, your dress is gonna be small. So, I mean, none of these things are really deal breakers, but there are things that make me think twice about sewing other patterns like this. And the thing is, there's so many people sew these, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone say this about the instructions. So it is a complaint. I think it's an issue that they probably should look into, but ultimately not a deal breaker if you like the drafting. The drafting is fine. The draft, I mean, there are no issues. Everything goes together as it should. It's really just a matter of instructions and the seam allowance. So that is a very long-winded way to say that the pattern is good. The instructions are One more thing. For some reason, I do not understand. The pattern calls for 18 buttons for the center front of the dress. Now, that must be a design choice because I used 11 buttons. Granted, I'm short, but I only shortened the whole dress 1/2 inch. So I used 11 buttons, and they are 2.5 inches apart from top of the button to top of the button. And that is close. So if you have 18 buttons on this dress, your buttons are going to be very, very close together. So yeah, I don't know why 18 buttons. I only used 11, and that was plenty. And speaking of buttons, because after my whole dress was made, I still wanted it to be smaller at the waist. Rather than place the buttons on the center front line of the left side of the bodice, I put it 1 inch in, so 1/2 inch further than I should have, just to give myself a bit of a bigger overlap and make the dress fit better. But that is not anything major or anything, and it's absolutely reversible. I can just move the buttons back to the center. And there you have it. That is my very long-winded, rambly review of the Love Notions lyric dress in this beautiful fabric from Mood Fabrics, the cotton sateen. And again, as I said, I will leave a link to the pattern. I will leave a link to the fabric in the description. And I do want to say that although Mood Fabrics did give me sore credit to get this fabric, all opinions are my own. They have not instructed me on what to say, and I am not actually being paid for this. So thank you so much for watching. If you have made it this far, you are a star. I will see you next time. Bye.